you remember how you were talking about when there's terms and conditions on the contract?
Yeah.
So could you just go over the terms and conditions in the sense, I remember the conditions, you said that can always be changed, but the terms can't be?
Okay.
Is that correct?
So, no. Let me explain it. They can all be changed.
Okay. Okay.
But again, this is also an important question, so everybody keep in mind. Okay, so terms and difference between terms and conditions. So terms are essential details of the contract. So terms would be, what is the price that the seller will pay, the buyer will pay, what is the possession date, what are the things that have been agreed upon, like whether the seller will offer title insurance, that type of stuff. So all the different sections, if you look at the purchase contract, all the different sections are terms, right? It will say section 1. It won't say the word section, but it'll say 1, right? And then 2 and 3. And then within that, there will be subsections. So all those are terms. Terms are the points that the buyer and seller are agreeing upon. Okay, so I said, we're going to do this, or this is what I'm offering. The seller says, okay, agree to that. So that's a term, right? So what we have, the buyer and seller have agreed to, those are the terms. Conditions, on the other hand, conditions are like financing condition, property inspection condition, seller selling their house condition, relocation condition, lawyer review condition. Then another one would be, for example, document review conditions. So those are all conditions. Okay. So one thing to keep in mind is read the question carefully. So there are two types of conditions. Conditions precedent, which is what we use in real estate contracts, which means conditions have to be waived before the deadline for it to continue. Then there's also conditions subsequent. And we see conditions subsequent in things like subscriptions, your Netflix subscription, any of those subscriptions. So in those subscriptions, like they will say, try it out for 30 days. If you don't like it, call and cancel. But if you do like it, you don't have to do anything. So that's a condition subsequent. So that means if you don't cancel the condition or remove the condition or, call them before then that means you have accepted the condition and everything will continue, right? So now read the question carefully. So this is where everybody gets tripped up. Don't just assume it's conditions precedent. So just keep that in mind. Not all conditions have to be removed because conditions subsequent don't have to be removed, but conditions precedent do have to be removed. So see the context that they're asking you the question in. If the context is in real estate contract, then it's always conditions precedents. And yes, conditions have to be removed before the contract can proceed. So if somebody forgets to waive the conditions, the contract is done, right? So in case of a real estate contract, if somebody fails, they forget that today is the condition removal date. So this is where timelines are very, very important in our line of business. We cannot argue with that. Timelines are the timelines and we have to meet the timeline. So in this case, if it says condition have to be removed by 7 p.m. on this and this date, it has to be removed. The seller's agent has to receive the waiver prior to that time for it to continue. If they receive it 5 minutes after 7:05, the contract is done. Now you have to write up a new contract. Right? So that's why it's very important. So the contract can move forward with unmet terms, but real estate contract cannot move forward without with unmet conditions. What that means is that, so let's say one of the terms was that the seller will have the place professionally cleaned before the closing date. Right. So generally what I suggest to anybody who's an agent with our brokerage, I always suggest have 2 terms in the additional terms, like you can add more terms. So I always suggest add 2 terms. So one would be that the seller will allow a walkthrough of the property prior to closing, a day before closing. And the second would be that the seller will have the property professionally cleaned. And if there are carpets, so you want to clarify, the seller will have the carpets professionally cleaned, and they will provide receipt. So that way we can confirm that they were professionally cleaned. And then so the seller will also have the place professionally cleaned, and that has to do with like bathrooms and things like that. So we have those three in there. So in this, the reason we do this is because we want to make sure that our buyer has a clean house, right, when they move in. But let's say those terms were included in the contract, and then you go to do a walkthrough with your buyer the day before closing. And this just happened. I was dealing with this yesterday. So the place was a mess. They were half packed, half stuff was moved out. So you cannot do a walkthrough like that. It has to be, right? It has to be like as per the contract, the day of, it has to be clean. So then what we can do is the contract will still move forward. Like the contract doesn't get canceled. So in this scenario, what would happen is we would have a chat with our lawyer, buyer's lawyer, and say, hey, we went to do the walkthrough. The place was not clean. Can you please hold back, I don't know, $1,000, right? Then this lawyer will hold back $1,000 until they have cleaned the place, right? So the next day, the day of the closing, when the buyer receives the keys, if the place is not clean, then contract's still closed, right? So they still got the property. However, the lawyer held back $1,000. And at this point, because the possession date is already there, the buyer will basically lose $1,000, right? Because they won't have time to fix those items. So that's what the unmet terms mean. So the contract will still move forward with unmet terms because they were supposed to do all the cleaning and they didn't do it. So the contract is still closing. So you can't say the contract is done, we're canceled. No, contract will still close, but there will be other things that will come into play. But if the conditions are not met, the contract is done. If they did not waive the conditions, you are done. So that's the difference between contract terms and conditions. So contract terms are points of agreement between the buyer and seller, and conditions are put in there for in order to protect the party that added them. So sellers can sometimes add conditions like dower condition, or review by the lawyer if it's an estate sale or something like that, right? Then it would be review by the lawyer. But normally most of the times, like 80% of the times, it would be buyer's conditions we see, but in those 20% of circumstances, we would see seller conditions as well. So conditions have to be removed before the contract can move forward. So the contract cannot move forward with unmet conditions, but it can move forward with unmet terms. So conditions are there to protect the party that added them. If they're seller conditions, it protects the seller. If they're buyer conditions, then it protects the buyer. Terms are points of agreement between buyer and seller, and conditions are impediments to the contract. That means it can stop the contract from moving forward. So those are the key points about conditions and terms.